please tell us your name and really what you've been up to and how you came here.
I'm Alan Goldhamer. I'm the director of the True North Health Center in Santa Rosa, California. True North Health is a residential care facility that specializes in medically supervised water-only fasting. And we're affiliated with the True North Health Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is public education and research. We have a website, fasting.org, which is a new fasting compendium website where all the information and research that we're doing and others is located. It's freely available to the public, www.fasting.org.
What are the benefits of water fasting?
Well, water fasting is a really unique biological adaptation that gives the body a chance to do what it does best, and that's heal itself. So many of the conditions that people are suffering from today, from obesity and high blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, lymphoma, and others, are caused essentially by dietary excess, the excess consumption of fat and protein and processed foods that lead to these conditions. And fasting is a way of giving the body a chance to mobilize and eliminate the consequences of many of these processes, and it does it very rapidly.
What are the negatives to water fasting?
Well, unfortunately, there's two types of water fasting. One is intermittent fasting, where you narrow the feeding window. People, maybe they don't eat breakfast before a certain time and dinner after a certain time. And in doing that, they give themselves 14 or 16 hours of fasting every day. And the thought is that the accumulation of these brief periods of fasting may have biological benefit in helping people control dietary excess and institute improved autophagy or other factors associated with improving their health. Another version of fasting is long-term medically supervised water-only fasting, and that's what we do at the True North Health Center, where people are going from 5 to 40 days on water only, but in a controlled setting. And there you have to make sure that the history exam and laboratories support the use of fasting, so the appropriate patient is fasting. They're monitored twice a day so that we ensure that it's done safely and effectively. Medications have to be appropriately withdrawn prior to initiating fasting. People have to be in a resting state so they don't end up depleting protein reserves, but rather burning their fat stores. And so if it's done properly, it can be done safely and effectively, but it does need to be done in a controlled setting. And that's the downside to long-term water-only fasting.
Should everyone fast? How often should people fast, and how long should each fast last?
So everybody does fast. They fast from the time they eat dinner until they break their fast with a break fast in the morning. The debate is about how long should that period of fasting be. We advocate a 16-hour period of fasting as a routine basis for people. For people with higher caloric needs, perhaps maybe you narrow that to 14 hours of fasting. But the point is that is something that is thought to be beneficial for all people, and not just have them eating round the clock, especially late at night right before they go to sleep. There's detrimental considerations about that type of food consumption. And then the idea is that people may benefit from periodic longer-term fasting, and that the research is still being done. We're doing some of that at the True North Health Center in conjunction with the True North Health Foundation. And so we're looking at changes in biomarkers and trying to determine really what's the ideal amount of time that a person would fast for a given condition and also for health promotion. I think ultimately we're going to find that people that use short-term fasting, that 5 to 10 day fasting, preventatively may actually be some of the people that gain the greatest benefit of all.
What health challenges does water fasting work for, and which does it not work for?
The conditions that fasting works the best for are conditions that are caused or contributed to by dietary excess. So obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, lymphoma, these conditions that are tied to poor dietary choices seem to benefit the most from fasting, which makes sense because the body is able to mobilize and eliminate these accumulated products of metabolism and exogenous toxic products in a rapid way. Conditions that involve depletion, or people don't have adequate kidney function or ability to adapt to the fasting state, like type 1 diabetes, would be relative contraindications. And so we avoid using fasting in people that are not going to have a good result.
Does fasting get rid of pathogenic bacteria in your gut?
Well, that's a very question of interest and active research. In fact, we've completed a study with Luigi Fontana from Washington University looking specifically at this issue of what happens to the types of bacteria that live in the gut and what happens to their byproducts. And so I don't have a definitive answer to those changes, but what we see clinically is a lot of conditions associated with gut problems seem to improve, ranging from ulcerative colitis to Crohn's on down. These patients do get better clinically when you use fasting in conjunction with a whole plant food SOS-free diet. Exactly how they're getting better, why they're getting better is something that we're hoping to be able to discover with our ongoing research.
Does fasting get rid of Lyme disease?
That's a very good question. Lyme disease is a complicated question because many people that are told they have Lyme disease are actually dealing with the consequences of previous Lyme exposure and or its treatment. Anybody that's been put on long-term antibiotics for extended periods of time often develops a sequelae that can be thought of as part of the overall syndrome, but not necessarily active Lyme disease itself. So if a person has acute Lyme disease, we recommend the appropriate use of antibiotics actually. For chronic Lyme disease, where the acute Lyme disease may have been treated, but the residual symptoms persist, these are often patients that actually are manifesting autoimmune disease. And autoimmune disease, including problems with post-treatment residuals from Lyme, often do respond well to fasting and diet and lifestyle change, but it can be a very challenging and difficult condition. And I don't think it's exactly black and white about which symptoms are caused by which problem. For example, antibiotics have an immunosuppressive effect. And so if you take antibiotics and you feel better, that doesn't necessarily mean it's killing off active infection. It may be because it's suppressing the immune response, it's reacting in autoimmune disease. So it can get very challenging and difficult determining which course of treatment is appropriate and which responses you're seeing are due to which effect. And I don't think the research there has even really begun.
If fasting is so effective, why doesn't the FDA and medical industry embrace it?
Well, it's interesting. Fasting at one point was considered criminal quackery, and more recently it's been considered more cutting-edge research just because there has been more research coming out. I think it's mostly upon people like us that are doing and utilizing this therapy to publish data in reliable sources demonstrating both its safety and its efficacy. Now, we have taken a major step in that direction. We published the first fasting safety study. People can view that on our website, healthpromoting.com. And that study carefully looked at 5 years of consecutive fasting patients and their adverse events and consequences. And the conclusion was that fasting is safe when it's done according to protocol. And so now we have that published in peer-reviewed journals, and as a consequence, Human Subject Committee are willing to approve appropriate studies that follow the protocol that we use at the True North Health Center.
You guys are the pioneers this time in history, that this hasn't been pioneered before.
Well, I think it has been pioneered before. It's just that we're fortunate to be at a time, and we're fortunate to have collected a group of skilled individuals that have the capacity to conduct scientific studies and actually publish credible data. I think a lot of times in the past you had really energetic doctors that were very much clinicians, and so their focus was just trying to stay out of jail and do the therapy and get people well. We came along with a team where we have clinicians, but we also have researchers. And working together, we've been able to kind of do, their strengths and weaknesses of each. And researchers don't make good clinicians. Clinicians oftentimes don't make good researchers. But by putting all of us together as a team, we've been able to both accomplish the clinical benefit as well as being able to document it in a way that's actually publishable. We've published several case reports here recently in the British Medical Journal, which is a major impact journal. And it's had a tremendous excitement amongst people that, because they're not used to seeing whole plant food diet and fasting and these types of things being effectively used at very serious conditions like lymphoma and like polypharmacy complications. And so, the fact that one, we're able to do it, but two, they're willing to publish it is, I think, a very exciting indication that maybe things will start to improve.
Does fasting prevent wrinkles, and does it get rid of wrinkles?
Yeah, actually, I don't think fasting prevents short-term wrinkles, because when you lose weight, sometimes wrinkling actually becomes even more apparent. It takes this body a while and the skin a while to adapt. So initially, after fasting, sometimes people notice an accentuation of wrinkles. Over the long run, though, wrinkles are essentially a source of free radicals. So you get free radicals interacting with collagen tissue, causing cross-linkaging. So I think what you can do is try to slow the aging process down by getting people to live healthfully, whether that's fasting or diet, lifestyle, exercise, etc. I think there'll be a slower tendency towards aging as a consequence of healthy living. Whereas something like smoking, where you bathe the body in free radicals, that's what causes smokers' face, is because people get a rapid aging process. And of course, it's not just the face, it's the whole body, including the inside of the vessels, which is why 80% of smokers never get lung cancer, because they die from heart disease before they live long enough to grow their tumors.
Does water fasting help prevent dementia?
Well, that's a good question. We know that increased circulating levels of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is associated with lower risk of dementia in at least rats. And that rats in cages that are given the opportunity to exercise have much higher BDNF and much lower dementia rates. It turns out that fasting also increases BDNF levels. In fact, if you look at the biomarkers associated with exercise benefit, oftentimes they mirror the same biomarker changes in fasting. And I believe that what may be going on there is that what you're measuring is factors that reverse the consequences of dietary excess. So both exercise and fasting help reverse the consequences of dietary excess, and one of those may be increasing levels of these biomarkers like BDNF that are thought to be associated with a lower risk factor for dementia.
How long do the benefits of fasting last?
Well, the benefits of fasting are directly tied to the diet and lifestyle changes that occur as a consequence of fasting. So if you adopt a health-promoting whole plant food, SOS-free diet, engage in regular exercise and get appropriate sleep, you're likely to see not only continuation of the benefit, but an accentuation of those benefits. A lot of the detoxifying enzyme pathways may be cumulative. They may accumulate. So again, specific scientific answers will be coming with the research that we're doing. What we see clinically is that it appears that every time people fast, there's an accentuating benefit. It gets easier to fast, there's a reduced total body load, but all of it's going to be dependent on healthful living. Health results from healthful living. Healthful living involves diet, sleep, and exercise. People that want to get healthy have to pay the price, and the price of health is healthful living.
How many fasts have you supervised? Has anyone died during a water fast you've ever overseen?
Well, fortunately, we've had somewhere around 20,000 patients undergo water-only fasting, and to date, we've had no deaths associated with water-only fasting. We have a lot of very seriously ill patients, so I think it speaks to the inherent safety and efficacy of fasting as it's done according to the True North Health Protocol. And the fasting safety study that we did, there was no deaths associated with fasting. And the one, what could be considered serious complication, was the case of hyponatremia, where sodium levels became too low and we had to use intravenous fluids, but the person did fine. Outcome was positive. Nonetheless, it is a serious business. We take it seriously, and we do careful medical evaluation and monitoring to try to ensure that fasting continues to be demonstrated as a safe and effective process.
What have been the results of the fast you've overseen? Have people resolved major health issues?
Well, we see a lot of seriously ill patients at the True North Health Center. Some people joke with us that the name should be True North Health, the last resort. Fortunately, now we're starting to see some patients earlier in their pathological processes, but what we treat very commonly are high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and ulcerative colitis and ankylosing spondylitis and psoriasis and eczema and asthma. We also treat patients that are struggling with obesity, as well as conditions like lymphoma. So, there's a wide variety of conditions. Most of them seem to be tied to dietary excess. A lot of the patients we see have dysbiosis or problems with their digestive system or their immunological systems. These conditions, typically respond well if their patients are appropriately selected, fasting is done appropriately. But to sustain the results requires getting people educated to sustain diet and lifestyle changes over the long term. If you go back to doing the things that cause the problems tend to recur.
The media often reports that alcohol in moderation is part of a healthy diet. What do you think about alcohol's impact on our health?
Well, my colleague John McDougall likes to say that people love good news about their bad habits. And when it comes to alcohol, there's probably nothing more apparent than that. Alcohol is not health food. Alcohol is a major contributing factor to high blood pressure. It's got 7 calories per gram, and as a consequence contributes to obesity. That's why men get the big beer bellies, the plumber's crack. We know that alcohol has detrimental effects on the gut microbiome, and the fact that there's a small amount of plant-based benefit, resveratrol or some antioxidant that might be left from the skin of grapes, we tell our patients just eat the grapes. They don't need to be taking toxic products in order to get some trace amounts of benefit that's still residual from the fact that they're plant-derived substances. Alcohol is a major contributing cause of death and disability in our country, and in our program, it's excluded.
Some people say beans and grains didn't exist until 10,000 years ago, and therefore are not our natural foods, and our bodies aren't programmed to eat them, and therefore we're meant to actually eat animal products. What does the best science have to say about it?
Well, you know, the fact is that you have a couple billion people on the planet that are living essentially on rice and beans, which are some of the lowest cost calorie products that on the planet, and in many cases doing very well on those substances. So there may be individuals that are sensitive to virtually any food, and the lectins in rice or beans may be no exception. There may be people that have, particularly when their gut's been debilitated, they have a lot of gut leakage, they may have some sensitivities to these more concentrated foods. In those cases, we encourage people to use starchy vegetable materials as a source of their complex carbohydrates, and they do fine. The fact that animal food may have been a part of the diet in the past doesn't necessarily mean today in the environment today that it's a good process. It may not be good for the environment, it may not be good from a moral, ethical, or spiritual viewpoint, and it's certainly not necessary or good from a health viewpoint. So we advocate an exclusively plant food diet that's free of the chemicals added to food, which includes salt, oil, and sugar.
Are hemp, flax, and olive oil good for us to eat? Should we try to include these oils in our diet, or should we try to avoid them?
We recommend the exclusion of all highly processed food products, including oil, salt, and sugar. Oils of all kind. Now, the fact that some are less bad doesn't make them good. It just makes them less bad. So we recommend that the fats in the diet come from whole foods. So, you know, if you want to take ground flax seeds, if you want to use walnuts, if you want to use avocado, that would certainly be acceptable in moderation, just because these very rich foods, it's easy to overdo them. So we advocate that most people are limiting their consumption of nuts or seeds to about an ounce a day. Our target is to get about 10 to 12% of calories from protein, about 15 to 18% of calories of fat for most people, and the balance coming from plant-based complex carbohydrates. Completely avoiding meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar.
Author Chris Kresser, who believes in paleo diets, says that according to studies, eating dietary cholesterol does not lead to higher rates of blood cholesterol in most cases. And even if eating saturated fat and dietary cholesterol does lead to higher saturated fat rates or blood cholesterol, it still doesn't correlate to higher death rates. Do you agree with this? Why or why not?
We know that the consumption of animal food does in fact associate with increased cholesterol levels. You've got a whole society testing that theory, and it's becoming very apparent what's going on there. Now, the fact that cholesterol isn't a perfect predictor of cardiovascular disease, I would agree with. It's not the most sensitive indicator that's out there. However, what does predict problems is consumption of excess animal foods. So the consumption of animal foods I don't think is health promoting. I think there's a whole body of evidence that supports that. And the fact that we're getting into the weeds over certain metabolic markers and what their significance is, and certainly there are some serious problems in how these data have been interpreted. But overall, my conclusion is that the less animal food that we consume in the diet, in general, the better off we're going to be. And we exclude all meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products from the diet of our patients, and I'll let the results of our patients speak for themselves.
How does someone protect their thyroid?
Well, one of the theories nowadays with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, the most common cause of hypothyroidism, is that the immune system is actually the problem. In other words, when you get Hashimoto's thyroiditis, it's your immune system attacking your thyroid. There's different theories about why the immune system might attack the thyroid. We know in the case of celiac disease, where the immune system attacks the intestinal tract, that it's caused by a gluten trigger, and that there's an HLA-DQ gene associated with higher incidence of those issues in patients with celiac disease. It turns out the HLA-DQ gene is also associated with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And so one of the theories is that in some people, the immune system attacks the colon when they're sensitive to gluten and get exposed. Other people, it attacks the thyroid gland. And so it may be that that might be one of the triggers, particularly with the modern wheats where they've made major genetic changes and in the plant, which has had some benefits, like you get about 10 times as much yield per acre and all that kind of stuff. But the consequences to the modification of the gluten itself may have set up a situation where some people are genetically vulnerable and develop autoimmune responses. We know in our experience with wheat in general that it's a very common trigger for many of our patients, and by the exclusion of wheat products, we oftentimes get improvements in joint pain, digestive function, and other things. So it's one of the things we do is we just routinely avoid the gluten-rich grains from the diet that we feed patients, and we've been very satisfied with doing that. It also gets rid of a lot of the products that are typically used with wheat, which are the crackers and the breads, the highly processed, high caloric density foods often used with sugar, oil, and salt, that may not be that health promoting in any case.
Do you eat a 100% plant-based diet? And if so, for how long have you been doing it?
Well, I'm turning 60 years old tomorrow, and I have been on an exclusively vegan diet for 44 years. So I had set out originally to do a 50-year experiment. So I've got about 6 years more and then I'll reevaluate. But so far it seems like it's working pretty well.
What advice do you have from all the research you've done on the best way to deal with memory issues and memory loss?
Yeah, so memory is a complicated issue. We know that there's a number of things that affect memory. One of the most important things is you don't want to have strokes. And we know that high blood pressure is the leading contributing cause of stroke. So avoiding high blood pressure by adopting a whole plant food SOS-free diet is an excellent way of avoiding hypertension and hopefully reducing dramatically the likelihood of stroke. We know that sleep deprivation or poor quality of sleep can affect memory and cognitive function. And so people that are overweight oftentimes have sleep apnea, or people that have inflammatory conditions, or people that eat too late at night, or people that are under too much stress. So all of these variables may alter sleep hygiene, and that may in turn have profound effects on cognitive function. The brain's ability to flush itself clean and purify itself with adequate quantity and quality of sleep. So we encourage people to sleep in a cool, dark, and quiet place, and sleep so long that they can wake spontaneously feeling refreshed. And that may vary from person to person, but it's oftentimes more than what people are getting. And chronic sleep deprivation cumulatively is thought to have a detrimental effect that may be associated with problems with cognition as well as dementia and other problems. Another aspect of improving sleep quality as well as cognitive function may involve exercise. People that engage in regular aerobic exercise are thought to have better function and better capacity. So we believe that those are the three hallmarks of healthful living: is diet, sleep, and exercise. And so we try to stay focused on all of them.
In Dr. Stephen Gundry's best-selling book, The Plant Paradox, he says lectins are microscopic proteins that plants evolved to defend themselves from predators, including insects and animals, that includes humans. They are essentially indigestible and have the unique ability to increase the permeability of your intestines. That means that they can pass through the wall of your gut and will and be treated as foreign invaders by your immune system. This causes an inflammatory response, which can set the stage for a host of diseases as well as weight gain. What foods are rich in lectins? Generally speaking, all grains and legumes have more lectins than anything else, and in some cases, pressure cooking can destroy the lectins. Nightshade vegetables, squashes, and select nuts and seeds are also rich in lectins. Do you agree with Dr. Gundry? Why or why not?
Well, I think that there's clearly some patients that are sensitive to various food factors in virtually any food you can identify. You can find patients that will have sensitivities. And I have no doubt that there are patients that have sensitivities to grains and legumes. We certainly see those in practice. And for those people, we eliminate those foods and we use other sources of plant-based starches as a source of calories. And sometimes there's a little bit of experimentation that goes on, particularly post-fasting. People are very sensitive and reactive. You just rotate foods in, watch what they can eat and what they can't eat. Sometimes with fasting that changes because probably of the healing of gut leakage. Some of the problems here is you have a damaged or inflamed gut that lends itself to leaking more of these proteins that normally would be filtered out by a healthy intestinal mucosal membrane. And so one thing is, in healthy people, they may be less vulnerable to these things, but in people that do have those problems, you can certainly use rotational feeding to identify and eliminate or minimize exposure to the foods that people seem to be sensitive to. Some people, you can feed them something once a week that you may not be able to feed them every day. Some people, you can just eliminate those whole classes of foods. And I have no problems. If the people don't do well with rice and beans, don't use rice and beans. Use starchy vegetable material. And most of the foods that we find people do very well with are the very foods, for example, that you could feed an infant. So if you think about a baby's more vulnerable and sensitive gastrointestinal mucosa, you wouldn't feed them certain, highly processed foods, whereas things like squashes and avocados or bananas or whatever it is, the foods that you normally can feed your infants, ironically enough, oftentimes are well tolerated by people that have very sensitive digestive systems. And those foods that generally aren't that tolerated, maybe those should be on the list of foods that you hold off on until the gut has actually had a chance to heal.
There are so many paleo, keto, Atkins, low-carb authors and books. Why are so many people who are well-educated, credentialed, and smart concluding that the low-carb diet, not the whole food plant-based diet, is best for human health? And what are the most compelling, important, and convincing studies that make you believe that a whole food plant-based diet is the proper diet for humans and that a diet that includes animal products is not?
Yeah, well, there's a pretty big literature. There are some people that have summarized that literature well in their books, Dr. John McDougall, T. Colin Campbell, Caldwell Esselstyn, and others that have done an excellent job of reviewing the literature in support of the idea that a whole plant food diet may be a health-promoting diet. There's epidemiological literature. In our practice, we see for the last 34 years, we've been using a whole plant food SOS-free diet with patients coming in with these conditions, the hypertension, the diabetes, the autoimmune disease, and we're seeing and documenting the results that we're able to achieve and maintain in those patients. And we're getting the 30 and 35-year follow-up on patients, where one of the most common comments they'll make is that everybody they know that followed the dead Dr. Atkins diet and all that are dead. So, the idea that whole plant food diets are a question as being a health-promoting diet, I think there's a pretty strong literature out there. It's broad, it's diverse. There's specific studies done ranging from Gene Orrish and others looking at the reversal of coronary artery disease. As far as the paleo diets, the Atkins diets, a lot of these are attempts to provide, their argument is basically this is a less bad diet than the conventional standard American diet with 86% of carbohydrates coming from refined carbohydrates and the use of all kinds of highly processed foods. They're not really comparing it to a whole plant food SOS-free diet. So those studies we need to do demonstrating the efficacy. That's not really what's going on. They're looking at all carbohydrates as the same, and of course they don't react in the body the same. There is a difference between sugars and complex carbohydrates and how the body processes, the effect on insulin, the effect on glucose levels, and how the response clinically manifests itself. So although we might all agree that refined carbohydrates create a lot of problem, the basic fuel of human beings by design from the beginning of time has been complex carbohydrates. The fact that people can subsist on a higher fat, higher protein diet doesn't make it necessarily health promoting. And of course, there is no literature supporting that a long-term high fat, high protein diet is a desirable diet. In fact, even the people that advocate those diets often represent them as temporary transitional means of helping facilitate weight loss. And because a high-fat diet induces fasting mimicking effects, for example, the hunger blunting that's associated with ketosis, they'll justify whatever the downside negative effects are because the net weight loss outweighs the damage that's being done from being on this high-fat, high-protein diet, particularly over the short run. And they may be right. They may be that as bad as the high-protein, high-fat diets are, they're not as bad as the high-protein, high-fat, sugary diets that are making up the conventional foods that people are making. But something being less bad doesn't make it good. It just makes it less bad. So I'm not going to argue, well, this diet's less bad than that diet, therefore we should recommend it. On the other hand, if you want to sell 10 million books, you need to tell people what they want to hear. And what they want to hear is that they can continue to indulge in their short-term pleasure-seeking, self-indulgent behaviors and somehow get away with it. They can overcome the laws of nature, violate the laws of physics. They can get the results they want without having to make any kind of sacrifices. And what we're trying to tell people is that, look, health results from healthful living. From our opinion, based on our experience and our review of the scientific literature, the diet that seems to be most health-promoting is a whole plant food diet, and that eliminates or at least minimizes the use of these commonly added chemicals in the form of salt, oil, and sugar.
What low-carb diets recommend getting your body into ketosis, and what's wrong with that?
Well, the reason they want to get you into ketosis is in large part because of the hunger blunting mechanism that goes along with it. And the benefits that they're likely deriving is the benefit of getting less excess calories in. So that's why they call them fasting mimicking diets. They're trying to mimic the benefits that we know are associated with fasting by doing something that doesn't require the vigors of actually fasting. So by eliminating the carbohydrate from the diet, your body, like in fasting, is forced to burn fat. It produces ketone bodies, and there's a hunger blunting effect. The problem is doing it that way and trying to sustain that long term results in downstream health compromise. So we don't really want to do that long term, even though there may be some short term benefit, i.e. rapid weight loss, associated with this diet. What we're interested in is encouraging people to adopt a health-promoting diet and lifestyle. Over the long run, they will progressively lose their excess weight, they will reverse the diseases that are reversible, and most importantly, it's sustainable. And we've been able to demonstrate that in patients that are doing this for literally decades now, and being able to look and see the direct clinical consequences. As a clinician, that's really, you can read all the books you want, you can look at all the science, you can do your best to interpret, but really what weighs most heavily is seeing the patient that comes in, they're sick, they recover their health, and then they're able to sustain those results following the prescription that you're advocating. And we're in a unique position at the True North Health Center because we have the patients come with us for weeks or months or sometimes even longer, where we're actually able to control their environment. And so you see the consequences of your advice, and if your advice is good, the results should be good, and it is.
What are the health implications from eating salt? How much of an effort should we make to avoid it? It seems to be in everything.
Well, it isn't everything, because everything people are eating is highly processed foods that don't taste very good because they're highly processed. And the way they make up for it is adding chemicals back to the food in the form of salt, oil, and sugar. The food just becomes a carrier agent to drive sugar, oil, and fat to your palate. So I think that it's important to try to minimize all salt, oil, and sugar by getting back to whole natural foods. So what does that mean? It means we're getting people to eat things like oatmeal and fresh fruit in the morning. It means having salads, steamed vegetables, potatoes, rice, and beans, up to an ounce of nuts a day. We don't need to have all the heated, beaded, processed foods once we get out of the pleasure trap. Once we free ourselves from the addiction of the artificial stimulation of these chemicals, then all of a sudden good food becomes more appealing. For people that are having trouble doing it on their own, we encourage them to come to the True North Health Center, undergo medically supervised fasting, reboot the palate, and then see what good food tastes like and see whether or not the results justify the extra effort that it takes.
Brian Clement from the Hippocrates Health Institute says that today's fruit is picked unripe and has been hybridized to be much sweeter than it was in nature many years ago. He says that fruit sugar is still sugar and that healthy people should limit fruit consumption to no more than 15% of their diet by weight, or around a piece a day. He says people fighting a health challenge should eliminate it completely until they're better. Do you agree with his recommendations?
Well, I agree and I disagree. I agree with some of his recommendations and his acknowledgement that fruits are hybridized products that are higher in sugar and lower in fiber than they might be, say, in a natural setting. If you go and eat some wild apples in Hawaii, you find they're very fibrous, lower sugar content foods. I disagree that fruits are not health-promoting foods for most people. What I do recommend, though, that when people eat fruit, that eat whole fruit, not all the juices and the processed stuff and the byproducts, and that when they eat fruit, it's good to include significant quantities of green vegetable material like lettuce and cucumbers and other high-fiber foods, because what we find is even patients that are a little bit sensitive to fruit, if they combine large amounts of salad-type material with their fruit, the fiber from the vegetable materials tends to slow the rate with which sugar is absorbed into the system, blunting the insulin effect. And for most people, this appears to be a perfectly acceptable source of health-promoting food. Now, there are patients that have debility. They have diabetes. They may be suffering with active cancer, etc., where even that smaller amount of sugar may be a compromising issue. And so for those people, we may limit or even eliminate the use of fruit from their diet for a period of time. So we see fruit as a health-promoting food when it's used appropriately. We don't want to make the basis of the diet around higher sugar foods. The base of the diet is around vegetable and vegetable starches. But we do see and do include fruit. You know, the most general description, we talk about one fruit meal a day and 2 vegetable-dominated meals a day. And even in that one fruit meal, we're often including plenty of greens and possibly grains. So it would represent a relatively small percentage of the overall calories in the diet, but certainly can still be a significant source of both enjoyment as well as nutrition.
Can too many cooked beans and whole grains raise our blood sugar and make us pre-diabetic or diabetic?
Well, I don't think that you're going to find that the major contributing cause to diabetes is going to be so much tied to carbohydrates as much as it's going to be tied to fat intake. I think there's going to be a stronger correlation of fat intake than complex carbohydrates. Now, it is true, refined carbohydrates and fat both may have contributory roles, and we want to limit or eliminate certainly excess fats and all refined carbohydrates. As far as complex carbohydrates like beans, I don't think that, beans themselves have a relatively lower glycemic index than some other sources of carbohydrates. They're generally well tolerated by patients that are diabetics. I don't think that beans themselves are the contributing cause, but dietary excess is clearly a major issue. And you can get dietary excess from virtually any product, particularly if salt, oil, and sugar are used in their preparation or in their serving. So you can overeat on just about anything if you adulterate anything with things like salt, oil, and sugar.
Does fruit contribute to type 2 diabetes?
Well, to the extent that type 2 diabetics are having problems with insulin resistance, and fruits are a source of simple carbohydrate, fruits will increase blood sugar levels in those patients. The answer is fixing the underlying insulin resistance so that their ability to tolerate that exposure might be improved. In the meantime, you may need to limit or eliminate fruit exposure just because their capacity to deal with simple sugars is so limited. But even in type 2 diabetics, you can often include limited amounts of fruit so long as those fruits are taken with large amounts of vegetable cellulose. The real problem here is getting people to eat enough vegetables. So we want people eating large quantities, big salads. We know that the salad's big enough when everybody you know looks at you and goes, "Oh my gosh, you're not going to eat all that, are you?" It's shock and awe. If they don't react with shock and awe, you got the wrong size bowl. We go get a bucket, because we want people eating as much vegetable-based materials as they can shove in so there's not too much room left for anything else.
Does it make a difference for health if you eat beef from organic grass-fed cows versus factory farm cows?
Well, clearly, organic products are going to have some advantages over non-organic products, but something being less bad because it doesn't have certain chemicals doesn't make it a health-promoting food. It's still not a health-promoting food. The fact that it's less tough on the environment, that it's less morally indignant, that it's less spiritually corrupt, doesn't make it acceptable. So what we're about at True North Health is trying to tell people the truth. We're not telling them to go east or west. We're trying to tell them the truth as we see it. And what we're seeing is that the healthiest diet for the individual, for the planet, for your moral, spiritual, and ethical considerations is a whole plant food diet. And we try to limit salt, oil, and sugar as well from this whole plant food diet.
What do the major studies and health organizations around the world recommend regarding eating animal products? And do you agree with their statements?
Well, I think in general, there's a general consensus that less is better than more. Most of them are under tremendous pressure not to advocate a whole plant food diet. That would raise all kinds of difficulties politically, economically, and otherwise. But you'll notice, like, for example, recently in Canada, they've come out with a new profile that really looks a lot closer to the type of recommendation we've been making for 45 years, where the plate is largely filled with vegetable-based materials, and they're recognizing a much more limited role for some of these more highly processed or animal-based products. I think that when you're doing consensus development like that, there's always going to be some trouble telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But the fact that they're shifting in what we consider to be the right direction, I think, is encouraging.
What do you feel is the importance of the Real Truth About Health conference?
Well, I think that one of the things the Real Truth About Health conference has done is it's brought people in with alternative views that are not necessarily all in agreement. And so it's an opportunity for people to hear different sides of the story, not just different than conventional, but even within the context of the alternative health movement, there's quite a disparity in terms of opinions and ideas. And so I think it's good to bring all of those ideas out, give people an opportunity unrestricted to express their views, and let people decide for themselves what resonates the best for them. And they can differentiate, I think, much better than people often think is possible. So I like the idea of lots of different ideas coming out. The fact that I don't agree with everybody, I think that's great. And the fact that everybody can express their opinions in a respectful and in a manner as such, I think, is a really healthy way, and it's a way that we can all be exposed to different ideas and hopefully grow and learn as a consequence.